At the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, we hear a word of wisdom about reading. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Even prodigious readers know the truth. There are a lot of books, but far too few great books. Amid all the options available to us for reading, it is hard to shake the feeling that the West is poorer than it has ever been in knowledge of what this small collection of great books contains. For those with eyes to see, how do they navigate the virtual shelves of infinite digital libraries and book dealers? T.S. Eliot once shared a word of wisdom about religion that is in sympathy with the plain pessimism of the author of Ecclesiastes. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. That is, we ought to find out what has mattered to our ancestors and follow suit. Likewise, although Eliot's literary output can often be difficult material for some readers, his creation of books was not merely for the novelty of adding to the pile. Rather, writing was a form of participation in and expression of the great books he had read, marked, and inwardly digested. Those of us seeking to follow the wisdom of Ecclesiastes in the 21st century are no longer naturally exposed to the once standard canon like Eliot was. Therefore, we need help figuring out what to read. Joseph Pearce is here to guide us. In his new book, Classic Literature Made Simple, 50 Great Books in a Nutshell, Pearce gives us what he calls appetizers, short accounts of the best of the best. It is enough to feast on for a lifetime for some of us, and it is a satisfying first course for others with more expansive appetites for fiction. Pearce takes us from Homer to Michael O'Brien, with a large helping of Shakespeare and other standard literary delicacies in between, encouraging us to expand our imaginations and submit ourselves to the truth contained in the crowning achievements of the Western tradition. Classic Literature Made Simple is an accurate but too modest title. It is easy and satisfying to read, but it inspires the reader to understand the world and our faith as a more wonderful and complex reality than we could dream of without the aid of inspired wordsmiths. Joseph Pearce is the author of numerous literary studies, including Literary Converts, The Quest for Shakespeare, and Catholic Literary Giants, along with biographies of Oscar Wilde, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Joseph Pearce is the general editor of the Ignatius Critical Editions series, and it is my pleasure to welcome him to the podcast now. Joseph Pearce, welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you. I'm a literary man myself, and I very much enjoyed reading your new book, which we're discussing today, which is called Classic Literature Made Simple, 50 Great Books in a Nutshell. Now, you have written a lot of books and articles, and you're well known as a champion for literature and for reading great books as a Catholic. Before we jump into talking about the book itself, I wonder if you could just remind our audience at the outset why it's important that we read great books.
Well, yes, I mean, one doesn't really know where to start or finish with a question like that, but basically that great works of literature hold up a mirror to man. They show us ourselves, and not just in a physical sense, but in a metaphysical sense. In other words, they show us who we are in the fullness of our humanity as Homo viator, pilgrim man or man on a quest, Homo superbus, the proud man who refuses the quest, so the good and bad that's within us, the bad is out in our hearts, and particularly with lyric poetry, and Anthropos, the Greek word for man, he who looks up in wonder. We basically access reality through wonder and through story. So, history is a story. Each of our lives is a life story. So we understand reality in terms of story and also in terms of wonder by looking up at the beauty of God's creation and communing with Him in it.
Yeah, I appreciate very much your perspective on that. That there's the Bible and there's the sacraments and the liturgy of the church and everything, but there's also a lot of stories that enrich us. And you have given us 50 of them in this new book, and I'm really intrigued by. I'd love to get your perspective on a number of them that you tell us about in the book. But before that, in the introduction to the book, you talk about you essentially discuss the question of what sorts of books we ought to read and what sorts of books we ought not to read, maybe. And you divide up basically all books into four categories. There are good books, good bad good books, and bad books. If I've got the terminology right, tell us about those and which ones we ought to read.
Yeah, so basically, books can be good or bad in two distinct ways. They can be good or bad aesthetically, in other words, good or bad in terms of how good or bad they are as art. I mean, someone can be given five talents, and if they use those five talents, they are going to produce something beautiful. Someone's given five literary talents, he's going to produce something which is beautiful literarily, but it might not be beautiful morally. So the point is, although we've been given that great gift of five talents in our pride or in our ignorance or in our bad philosophy or morality, we might use those five talents to serve up something which is literarily, artistically beautiful, but is pursuing a pernicious, even diabolical agenda. So we have to judge works in terms of their merit as art, but also as their merit as morality. And a good book is one that passes the test on both counts.
Yeah. For myself, I find increasingly there was a time maybe a few years ago when I wanted to read some of the good bad books so that I just sort of knew what things were and how to engage with certain things. And there's still a bit of that in my diet, I guess. But the good books are increasingly the ones I really want to spend my time on.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think in the introduction, as there are so many good books. I mean, the great works of Western civilization, there are so many of them that why would we really want to squander our time reading anything else? Even great works of literature that are bad morality. Why bother when you can read great works of literature that are good morality? The one caveat I would give is I've been spending a lot of time over the last year or two reading contemporary Catholic fiction. And if it's really bad as art, irrespective of how good it is as morality, it goes in the rubbish. But I'm actually pleasantly surprised at how few are that bad, and so some are actually authentically good books, but some are not bad good books. If you see what I mean, they're
Yes.
sort of they're okay as art and good as morality, and they're on my shelf, and they'll stay on my shelf. And I certainly don't think it was a waste of time for me to read them. I do think that we should know what's happening out there in a contemporary sense. We need to be part of a living contemporary Catholic culture as well as a living traditional Catholic culture. And so we need to know what new authors are writing books out there. So therefore, we need to find time to patronize. We're not going to have a cultural revival or a Catholic literary revival unless there are readers as well as writers. So
Right.
we do have to be aware of what's new, and like you pick a book from from a shop, it may be not as good as you hoped, but that's a chance you take. So that's the one caveat I would say is I am spending time reading contemporary Catholic literature, most of which is not good, some of which is, but quite a bit of it is not bad good, which is worth reading.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the good, starting in the ancient world, the pre-Christian world. All 50 of the books, I believe, on your list are Western books. These are from kind of broadly the European literary tradition. Most of them, I guess, are Christian and Catholic, but the first few, the first several on the list are pre-Christian, pagan works, but ones that are nonetheless extremely important to our formation. Tell us a bit about the selections that you chose in that category.
Yeah, so the 50 books are arranged within the book. chronologically. So obviously the first books are the oldest, and then the last books are the most recent. So it does allow the reader, if you like, to take a little pilgrimage, or a little journey, a little tour through Western civilization for a period of almost 3,000 years. So the first few titles, first six, if I remember correctly, I don't have them in front of me, are from pre-Christian times. So it's the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, the three great epics of the pagan world. And then I think I select all three of Sophocles' Oedipus cycle. So three plays and three epics. Now, apart from the fact that these are foundational to Western civilization and therefore Christian civilization, I like what C.S. Lewis said about the pagans. He said there's a big difference between the pagans and the so-called neo-pagans, the skeptics and the postmoderns of today. He said the pagans are like a virgin awaiting the coming of the bridegroom, whereas the neo-pagans and the postmoderns are divorcees who have walked away from the marriage. So if we see Homer and Virgil and Sophocles as the virgin muse that's awaiting the coming of the bridegroom Christ, you can actually see that they're grappling and groping in the right directions, asking the right questions, and coming to many of the right answers as far as they're able in the absence of the fullness of the light of revelation. And they're absolutely great. I mean, without Homer, there would not be Virgil. Without Virgil, there would not be Dante. Without Sophocles, there probably wouldn't be Shakespeare. So, that this is part of a living tradition that we should be thankful for as part of our roots as Christians. And we need to be rooted. And that means that we need to be aware of these roots and know them.
Yeah, and one of the questions that I'm sure you get about many of the authors and books that you promote, and maybe never anywhere greater than in these ancient works, is, are these things that your typical person can just pick up and read? Do you recommend that anyone read the Iliad, for example?
Yeah, so I would say that certainly once someone reaches the freshman high school age, possibly if you have a precocious, articulate middle schooler, I'm sure it probably is. I mean, I've met 8-year-olds that are reading the Lord of the Rings for the third or fourth time. So obviously you have precocious youngsters, but really, from teenage years onwards, I would say that all of the works no, that's not true of all of the works in there. Some of them require an element of emotional maturity that perhaps we should wait until, say, undergraduate age rather than high school age. Works like Brycehead Revisited, which we can discuss a bit later if you like. But certainly the pagan classics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, absolutely. The Aeneid, absolutely. Sophocles, I would say that the Oedipus Rex should not be read in isolation. I make a point of that in there. You need to read Oedipus Rex in relationship to its sequel, Oedipus at Colonus, because Oedipus at Colonus explains the mysteries and the riddles that are raised in Oedipus Rex. And if you read Oedipus Rex by itself, you're left lots of questions and not much answers, and not many answers, and you might find yourself somewhat confused and confounded. But the answer to the riddles are to be found in the sequel, Oedipus at Colonus. So those two should be read side by side. And on that basis, Oedipus Rex has a sort of somewhat adult theme, but I certainly think high school age kids, particularly in our day and age, when they're seeing all sorts of bad stuff anyway, is not going to do them any harm. Will probably do them an awful lot of good.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's come into the Middle Ages. You tell us about probably a selection of the most famous works from the Middle Ages written in vernacular languages. Anyway, you tell us about Beowulf, and you tell us about Sir Gawain in the Green Knight, and I really appreciated especially your chapter about Dante and the Divine Comedy. You say about the Divine Comedy that it's arguably the greatest poem ever written. It is also profoundly Catholic to its theological and philosophical core. Now, I know a lot of people just know about the Divine Comedy, and they think, oh, well, our visions of heaven, hell, purgatory, all that comes from Dante's poetic vision. But there's so much in the Divine Comedy. And I just really appreciated what you wrote about it. What more can you tell us about kind of the importance of reading those great works?
Well, as regards Dante, I think the same sort of advice and cautionary words are needed as we just employed with respect to Sophocles and the Oedipus cycle, that is so common, particularly in secular schools, but alas, it's not uncommon even in Catholic schools, for only the Inferno to be read. And that is a huge error. First of all, because the Divine Comedy is one work, not three works. It's like reading the Fellowship of the Ring and say you read the Lord of the Rings if you haven't. You just read the first third of it. But the whole purpose of Dante's descent into hell is to ascend Mount Purgatory and then ascend into heaven. There's no purpose in going to hell otherwise. So if we find ourselves basically ending the story with Dante in the presence of Satan and then just emerging at the foot of Mount Purgatory, we've not read it at all. So it's very important for us to try to read the whole work. And I do say that if you can't read the whole work, or if you're in a school situation where you just don't have time to teach the whole work, it's actually better, and this is what the approach I take, it's better to select 10 cantos from each of the three works, for each of the three books, so 10 cantos from the Inferno, 10 from Purgatorio, and 10 from Paradiso, to at least give the students a feel for the structure of the whole thing, rather than reading just one of those three to the exclusion of the other two.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And what you do in that chapter, you do in so many of the chapters, where you help us to understand, how we ought to approach some of these texts. And that leads me to raise the next author I want to talk about, which is Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, of course, forms, in a sense, kind of the largest bit of the book. Of the 50 selections, 11 of them are Shakespeare. So to me, reading the book, what you're saying to me is 22% of your reading could be, maybe should be, Shakespeare. Is that right?
Actually, I would say yes. I was recently asked to design the perfect, of course, nothing's perfect except for Christ, but the ideal classical Catholic liberal arts high school curriculum for literature. And I actually had the whole of the junior year reading Shakespeare and nothing but Shakespeare. Of course, you have different approaches. You can spread it out over the 4 years, do some of the easier plays like Romeo and Juliet or Julius Caesar at maybe the freshman, sophomore level, and sort of do 2 or 3 plays each year, or do what I just said, because I want to do the whole thing chronologically. So the first year was the pagan literature, and then the sophomore year was medieval literature, the junior year was Shakespeare, and the senior year was modern, so 19th and 20th century, basically. So, I would say, so that in that curriculum is 25% of the reading, not even 22%. So, I certainly think that Shakespeare is someone that we should be reading all the time. His insights into human nature, his theological and philosophical grasp of reality from a profoundly Catholic perspective allows us to go deeper into who we are as Catholics, as human persons, our relationship with God, our relationship with our neighbor, our understanding of ourselves. I mean, all of that comes out through the reading of Shakespeare. And so reading Shakespeare is never time wasted, but always time well spent.
Yeah, and also timely in the sense that you had some real insights in all 11 of your chapters about the Shakespeare plays that struck me. I like many people I've read a lot of Shakespeare. I think I've read all the plays that you talk about. But I just have in my mind this default setting, which is, well, Shakespeare was writing in this sort of golden age. But actually, you make the point again and again that actually Shakespeare is writing in quite dark times in a way. And we're living in difficult times that maybe Shakespeare can really help us through. Would you say more about that, like the specific context of the kind of the darkness that Shakespeare is dealing with in some of those plays?
Yeah, so I mean, apart from this book, I've published 3 books purely on Shakespeare for Ignatius Press, and one of which is called Through Shakespeare's Eyes, Seeing the Catholic Presence in the Plays. And my approach to Shakespeare is to try to see the plays as far as possible through the eyes of the playwright, through Shakespeare's eyes. So my first book for Ignatius was The Quest for Shakespeare, which is looking at the biographical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism, who Shakespeare was as a man and the times in which he lived. And then we used that understanding to help us understand the plays. So, yes, Shakespeare was living in very dark times. He was almost certainly a believing Catholic and possibly and probably a secretly practicing Catholic. He alludes to this actually in one of his sonnets. But So in Shakespeare's time, in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, it was punishable by death to be a priest. It was punishable by death to hide a priest from the authorities, and the refusal to attend the services of state religion, which is what recusant Catholics did, refuse to attend. They were fined huge amounts of money. So Catholics were executed, persecuted, exiled, imprisoned. And this is the culture in which Shakespeare is living. So we're always tempted to think that we're living in the worst of times. As Dickens reminds us at the beginning of Tale of Two Cities, it's the best of times and the worst of times. All times are the best of times and the worst of times. There are always good things happening, and there are always really bad things happening. But certainly, Shakespeare's time, as regards the very bad things that are happening, are worse than they are now with respect to religious liberty. Certainly.
Yeah, well said and well argued in all of those chapters. One more Shakespeare question. I can't help myself since there's so much of the book devoted to it. As I mentioned before, when we were talking about Dante, you make a point throughout the book of kind of pointing out places where we might not, or as a culture maybe, or as a people maybe aren't always reading certain classic works the right way. And I loved how you displayed that I'll just give three examples. Romeo and Juliet. We read it as this sort of tragic lover's tale. You say it's actually better read another way. King Lear. It's just a man goes mad rather than maybe it's sort of more like a man is converted. And then most of all, The Tempest. I really, really loved how you dealt with The Tempest, that we just read it in this de facto way that it's just this sort of, oppressor and oppressed thing. And you say, let's not read it that way. Could you say a little more maybe about any of that?
Sure. So, it's something that I call Shakespeare abuse. And it's rampant. That basically producers and directors and readers, they do what they want with the plays rather than what C.S. Lewis said there are two types of people. There are those who do things to books and those who allow books to do things to them. Now, so what Shakespeare abusers do, they do things to the book, right? They do things to the play. They misread it in the light of their own pride and prejudice. They read into it their own agendas, and in consequence, they're not reading the play that Shakespeare wrote. Right? They're distorting and perverting the play that Shakespeare wrote for their own purposes. So it's very important for us to know something about Shakespeare in his times. For instance, a little tidbit of information is that that when Shakespeare was writing Romeo and Juliet, his own daughter was Juliet's age. He actually makes Juliet younger in the source poem which he used by Arthur Brooks. Juliet is 16. Shakespeare makes her 13. So, a child, and she's meant to be seen as a child. Shakespeare's own daughter is 13. The play's being written by the father of a teenage girl, right? So it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing passions, whether it's the passion of hatred, which is the problem of the Capulets and Montagues, or whether it's the passion of eros, erotic passion, which is the problem of Romeo and Juliet. Right, allowing our passions to rule our heads is perilous, and in the case of Romeo and Juliet, deadly. So I think that's the moral that is being portrayed in that play, and we're misreading the play if we read it as some sort of nice romance between two young people and those pesky adults getting in the way. Is exactly what the play is not about.
Yeah, I think readers will really enjoy seeing the way you analyze that one and some of the other ones too. Let's talk about Milton, Paradise Lost. I was really struck by your chapter on that because it occurred to me that maybe this is one example in your book of a good bad book, possibly. I mean, just in the sense that Milton, Paradise Lost is full of heresies, at least from a Catholic perspective. So why did you include Paradise Lost?
Yeah, and that's actually an ouch moment when you sort of say we should perhaps look at a Pilgrim's Progress, Paradise Lost as a good bad book, because there's a lot of truth in that. And I know that, for instance, I differ, and this is probably the most controversial chapter in the book. I differ with defenders of Milton, such as C.S. Lewis, who obviously on most things I admire greatly. But yeah, he tried to defend Milton. But the fact is that Milton's heterodox, and that heterodoxy is made manifest in the epic. So we see that he doesn't believe in the Trinity, that the Father is a separate being from the Son. He also doesn't believe in the incarnation, because the Son is a creature. And the other big mistake he makes, he anthropomorphizes Satan, so that Satan comes across as a tragic hero who's very courageous. I mean, it takes a guerrilla raid, or all the other demons are cowardly and refuse. So the great leader himself, Satan, single-handedly takes on God and the Son and what have you. And it's almost, even his tempting of Adam and Eve is seen as sort of almost, I say almost, it's important, but almost a justified anger, right? That we can almost sympathize with the devil when we're talking about Milton's devil. You can't sympathize with the devil when you're talking about Dante's devil. And I think that's a key distinction.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that chapter, and I'm sure that readers will as well. And I think it's a good, for those who haven't read Paradise Lost, and it's not read as often these days as it once was. I think reading what you have to say about it will encourage people to pick it up. So I think that will be a good one for many. Now, Jane Austen is an author that I would expect probably a lot of people who pick up your book do read or have read. Her books are just so rich, and also have been made into films and television series so many times that many of us anyway are very familiar with those stories. I appreciated how in your discussion of the two Jane Austen novels, you put on the board for us to consider, the tension, or the question of like romanticism and rationalism. These two things sort of tugging at each other. What do we have to learn from Jane Austen about that?
Yeah, Jane Austen actually is a great philosopher, and we think about her as a great storyteller, great novelist, and and maybe even some of us, not me, but some of us might even dismiss her for writing girly books. That's really books just for girls to read, because it's about basically women. It's a woman writing about women. It's not. It's a great philosopher and Christian philosopher or storyteller writing about people. Even as regards women, as I say to must be the high school age men or young men, that Jane Austen teaches us about women, and it's one of the most important things that men need to know is about women. So we certainly should be reading much more of her. But yes, so examples of her philosophy in Pride and Prejudice. I mean, that the whole philosophical ethos of that novel is encapsulated in the title. That insofar as we have pride, we will be prejudiced, and we will not see the truth that's there, because we'll be blinded by our own sin, by our own pride. So that's the key note of that. But Sense and Sensibility, which I find even more intriguing, she's writing right in the mania for romanticism that was around at the time she's writing this, in the sort of second decade of the 19th century. This is, it's the golden age when Wordsworth and Coleridge and William Blake, that first generation of romantic poets, and then the second generation are just coming through at around the time that she's writing. Byron, Shelley, Keats. We have Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein as a romantic classic, all at this same time, basically, as Jane Austen's writing. And that's, again, very important for us to know, because what Sense and Sensibility is this sort of tension between sense as in reason, right, and sensibility as in feeling. Because the thing with the Romantics, it was all about the Enlightenment, the rationalism of the Enlightenment, the empiricism of the Enlightenment was all about reason to the exclusion of feeling, right? It has to be quantifiable, scientifically verifiable, it has to be measurable, empirical. And so the Romantics were in many respects a healthy reaction against that, saying, no, you can come to truth through your feelings. You can come to truth through the experience of beauty. It's not, truth cannot be encapsulated in that which is purely physical. There's a metaphysical dimension to truth. So that was all very good. But the trouble with the Romantics is they then started saying, well, The only thing that matters is the heart, and to hell with the head, right? And so Jane Austen, being the great philosopher and level-headed and good-hearted person that she was, basically shows the way if you go one extreme, nothing but reason, you're going to end up getting things wrong. And the other extreme, if it's nothing but emotion and sensibility, you're going to get things wrong. That the via media, in a very Aristotelian sense, the via media between those two is virtue. And it's the connection of faith and reason in some indissoluble marriage and not a divorce.
Yeah. I love how you make that point in your 2 chapters about Jane Austen. It definitely made me want to go back and pick her up. You did mention Mary Shelley's Frankenstein a moment ago as a kind of great work of romanticism. You do include that in the book here, and I'm glad that you did because, for me, I think it's just one of the most important works for our, I don't know, sort of understanding the world we live in today, this scientistic paradigm. So yeah, I'd love if you have anything more to say about Frankenstein.
Yeah, well, the first thing is it's astonishing that it's a novel written by an 18-year-old girl. That in itself is astonishing. So therefore, there's an element of immaturity in it. There's an element of confusion in it. But what makes it a great book is the ingredients that are in it. Because again, she's grappling with the romanticism. When she's writing it, she's eloped with Pearce Shelley, the romantic poet. He's an atheist who's also somewhat enamored of science as well as being romantic. And we see her grappling with, science being abused. So Dr. Frankenstein that abuses science in pursuit of what we might call a culture of death. And the consequences of that scientific culture of death it plays itself out horrifically in the story. So I think there are some very valuable lessons in our own, should we say, technomanic times in the reading of Frankenstein. So, it's a good book. There's an element of incoherence in it because she's an 18-year-old she's a crazy mixed up kid, but she's a crazy mixed up kid, right? Asking many of the right questions, and for the most part, coming at least suggestively to most of the right answers.
Yeah. Um, that leads me to ask you about Charles Dickens, who I think in some ways has much of the same thing that we find in Jane Austen. There's head and heart, but then also there's a kind of a critique. There's really a shining a light on the kind of the problems of Victorian society that are the product of kind of industrialization and all these things that are going on, right? So you've picked a Christmas Carol and A Tale of Two Cities as the two selections from Dickens. Why those two?
Well, I mean, if it's going to be a confiteor moment, part of the reason is that Dickens remains largely with me a sin of omission. I've only read about 5 or 6 of his works, so many of his works I haven't read, and obviously, unless I'm going to go sit down and read them, I'm not going to be able to write about them very eloquently. So I'm obviously the book is playing to my strengths. Dickens is not one of my strengths. So one of the reasons that there's only those two is they're two that I actually know quite well, as opposed to many of the others which I don't know as well. So, but on saying that, I know to justify myself beyond the confiteor, is that The Tale of Two Cities is the best-selling of all of Dickens's works. It's normally considered to be the second best-selling novel of all time. So it's certainly a work that would have been odd for me to have left out. And as regards Christmas Carol, I mean, certainly in the age of the age of film, it's been adapted so many times that everybody knows whoever needs a Scrooge is. They know the story. It's almost as well known as the parable of the prodigal son, which of course it mirrors in many ways. So it's become both of those works, and if any particular Christmas Carol, has become part of the very fabric of who we are psychologically. Scrooge is someone who haunts us. Right? We don't want to be like him. We don't like to see other people being like him, but we do love the conversion. And that's that what Tolkien would call that catastrophic moment, that sudden joyous turn in the story where Scrooge wakes up on Christmas morning and learns how to celebrate, right?
Yeah. Your confiteor, by the way, is most welcome and encouraging. Actually, I would imagine to most of our our listeners and to me personally. I mean, I can imagine, even well-educated people are, sometimes a little embarrassed that probably that they haven't read a lot of the selections, for example, that you put in this book. And really, there's no shame in it. I myself haven't actually read A Tale of Two Cities, so having read your account of it, it encourages me to do that, and other titles in the book as well. And I think maybe.
What would be fun? I don't think Ignatius Press would publish this because I could do this very easily. You know, classic literature we should read, and just list 50 great works that was great as the works I've included in this. That should be in a book of great literature which I haven't read, and the whole book could just be blank pages because I haven't read them. So
Yeah.
yeah, I could list 50 great works that I know I should read, I would like to read, and haven't yet done so. So yeah, I mean, all of us in the same boat. Thanks be to God that Western civilization, Christian civilization, produce so many great works of literature. It's not really possible, and unless we can do nothing but read,
Mhm.
and are naturally wealthy and not many attachments to be able to do that, and that probably want to be very healthy anyway. Now, none of us are going to be able to read all the great works, and this is one thing about this book. I hope is that that most of us are not going to be able to read all of those 50 books, but at least by reading this book, you've got some inkling or some understanding or some idea of what these great works, which you may never read, are about. And that's also an important part of our education, I think, is to at least know what these works are about, even if we don't have time to read them.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely is a valuable aspect of the book that you've written. As we come up into kind of the 20th century, you talk about Oscar Wilde and the picture of Dorian Gray. He's one of those figures that is kind of claimed by certain groups, maybe that is, and whose kind of identity and whose outlook on things is probably a bit false. And so you set the record straight a little bit in this chapter. Tell us why you put the picture of Dorian Gray on there.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's one of the great Victorian novels. It's not quite 20th century. It's published in 1890. Wilde died in 1900, so right at the turn of the 20th century. I think that I would like a book I'd like to write, probably never will. It's a book about the decadent movement, both in France and in England, because it's amazing and astonishing how many members of the decadent movement, poets and artists and novelists, actually became Catholic, of which Oscar Wilde is an example. He's received into the church on his deathbed. Because I think what the picture of Dorian Gray shows, and what some of these other great decadent works show, is that if we find ourselves empowered, self-empowerment's all the rage now, right? If we find ourselves self-empowered, that we can indulge all of our sensual appetites and get away with it, would it make us happy? Right. And what we find in the picture of Dorian Gray is if we could do that, and many of us, particularly if we're not Christians, many of us might fantasize about doing that, just having the self-empowerment to do what we want and get away with it. That would that make us happy? And what the picture of Dorian Gray is a cautionary tale that shows us no, it wouldn't. We'd make ourselves and everybody else miserable. It's not a good idea, even if you have the power.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And on that note, we're ready to come into the 20th century for real. I apologize. Of course, we were still in the 19th with Oscar Wilde, but not obviously not all of the authors that you focus on are Catholic, because a lot of them were in England when, after the Reformation, right? But we see the very thing that you started to talk about there with the decadent movement. We have this sort of wave of English people and Americans, I suppose, becoming Catholic. And you focus on a few of those converts here in the book. Robert Hugh Benson, G.K. Chesterton, and Evelyn Waugh are three of them anyway. Let's start with Robert Hugh Benson, because Lord of the World is a book that I think more people read now than used to read, but I still don't think enough people read it. And in my mind, it's right there with 1984 and Brave New World and That Hideous Strength, and maybe one or two others as one of the great, what we call, I guess, dystopian novels. And it's so interesting that it came before those other books. So tell us about Benson.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree completely with your analysis and critique there. That Benson is not as well known as he should be in general. He wrote many good novels, but also Lord of the World in particular is not as well known as it should be, because it was a dystopian novel very much ahead of its time. I mean, it was written 20 years or so before Brave New World, and 40 years or so before 1984. And in many ways, with the wisdom of hindsight, which of course these dystopian novelists did not have, right? They're writing futuristic novels. That's dangerous, and often such novels look very silly after a while. So for a novel in this genre to stand the test of time really shows it has the mark of prophecy about it. And Lord of the World does have a mark of prophecy about it, because what it's really showing is the rise of secular fundamentalism, where it's where these secularist rulers who seem to be nice are really veritas vampires. They suck the truth out of things and just present that which is seemingly good, whereas in actual fact it's realistically evil. And of course, in this world where you've got these demagogues that are sort of ruling, and everyone's sort of idolizing these politicians, right? And again, this is ahead of we had, after this was written, we have Lenin, we have Stalin, we have Hitler, we have Mussolini, all of these totalitarian secularist dictators who were idolized by people almost as gods. So this was ahead of its time. And of course, one consequence of this is the persecution of the church. Many Catholics being tempted to follow the zeitgeist instead of the Heiliger Geist, the spirit of the age instead of the Holy Spirit, and becoming modernists and adopting and adapting themselves to the secular ideologies. I mean, it's a work of great prophecy, and more people need to read it.
It's an absolutely extraordinary book. I really hope that people read your account of it and then get themselves a copy. Both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, I think, publicly praised that novel, so it's important. You include The Man Who Was Thursday, which is a very weird book by G.K. Chesterton. Also a very good book, but a very weird book. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I actually use the word weird. I think I would run with that word, but we'll employ the original meaning of the word from the Anglo-Saxon, W-Y-R-D, from which we get the modern word weird. And the Anglo-Saxons understood weird as basically we're all part of a weird woven web. Now, the web is woven, if you like, providentially by God, and everything we do within the web impacts everything else in the web. And obviously, those parts of the web which are closest to us will be impacted more, like ripples on the stream. But basically, if we're disruptive to the web, we're causing disruption, right? If we're harmonious, we're causing harmony. So this deep understanding of the word weird, I think, is very applicable to The Man Who Was Thursday. It is weird in both senses of the word, but especially, I would say, in its deepest level, in that older sense of the word, where these detectives in the novel are trying to discover who this mysterious figure called Sunday is, and in so doing, they learn to discover not just who he is, but who they are. They learn to understand themselves, but also they understand the cosmos, and they understand philosophy and theology much better. And the presence of God within the cosmos. So basically, this is a quest, not ostensibly to solve a crime or to catch a criminal, but in actual fact, it's a quest deeper into the weirdness of reality.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed your chapter on that, and I want to get to some other authors, but our readers will enjoy your other chapters that you have about other novels by Benson, Chesterton. You also have a couple of chapters about Hilaire Belloc novels and Yves Lenoir, whom I mentioned before. All really terrific. Let's come up to T.S. Eliot, Tolkien, and Lewis. Let me start with Eliot. You included The Wasteland, which I loved that chapter. It was so good. But you didn't include the Four Quartets, which I thought was interesting because the Four Quartets is sort of his great Christian poem set, and the Wasteland is before that. I love what you wrote about the Wasteland. I just love to know more about your choosing there.
Yeah, well, I suppose you got to you squeezed the confiteor out of me earlier, and now you're going to squeeze the mea culpa, because yes, I had Four Quartets. I mean, absolutely warrants and deserves a place in this book. There are only 50, and I don't know which ones I'd want to leave out to put it in. That's part of the problem. But I think The Wasteland is the reason it's in there. first of all, I love it as a poem, but also I think it speaks very powerfully, not just to its own time, the 1920s when it was published, but to our own time, the 2020s, because the wasteland is modernity. The wasteland is the modern world. The wasteland is the desert. That's the consequence of the denial or the absence of the living water, which is baptism and Christ. And basically, the whole poem is it's a bit like a Lenten journey into the desert, where but the desert is our own world in which we live, right? Not some sort of strange place we might read about in the Bible or elsewhere. It's the desert, the wasteland is all around us. We're in it. And the wasteland as a poem, I think, enables us to see it as a Lenten journey, the purpose of which is ultimately purgatorial and redemptive. And that's why at the end of the poem, we basically have the poet embracing the peace that passes all understanding, which is the presence of Christ. There's the arrival of rain, which is, again, the symbolic, the arrival of grace, baptism. So to me, it's a wonderfully mystical work of Christianity, even though it's not as obviously so as four quartets.
Yeah, yeah, well said, indeed. Let's hit Tolkien and Lewis real quick here. I would imagine most people who pick up this book are familiar with Tolkien and Lewis. Well, let's start with Lewis, actually, because the selection that you made for him was interesting. There, I mean, of course, here again, sin of omission. Like, what couldn't you pick by C.S. Lewis? But you picked Till We Have Faces, which is one that I would imagine maybe a number of people who pick up this book haven't read. Like, they maybe have read The Great Divorce, or they've read the Chronicles of Narnia, they've read other things. Why'd you pick Till We Have Faces?
Yeah, well, some of it's rather boring logistical reasons. So, for instance, I didn't want to do the Chronicles of Narnia as one chapter, and I couldn't spare seven, and I certainly wouldn't leave some out. That would be diabolical. Same thing with the space trilogy, right? Picking one to the exclusion of the other two would be odd. You've either got to talk about all three of them, or don't talk about any of them. So those sort of decisions were almost made for me. I can't remember. You've got the book that I have. Is The Great Divorce not in there?
It's not. No, no.
Just Till We Have Faces. Yeah.
Just Till We Have
But The
Faces.
Great
Yeah.
Divorce is wonderful and probably should be in there too. But my defense for if I was only going to include one work by C.S. Lewis, it would be Till We Have Faces. So I'm happy to defend myself here, and I can quote a very powerful witness to support me, and that's C.S. Lewis himself, who considered Till We Have Faces to be his greatest work. I agree with him. I do think it's his greatest work as literature. He avoids the temptation to which he normally succumbs, of allowing his desire to teach to become the practice of preaching. And really, preaching does not belong in literature. You can teach, but you have to do it with the subtlety and the nuance that precludes preaching. And Lewis sometimes indulges in preaching in his works, but not until We Have Faces, which makes it more difficult than the others. The allegory is not as obvious, but really what it's really saying is that it's very similar to what we talked about Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, that as long as we are narcissistic, as long as we are as long as we are proud, we are not able to actually face our neighbors face to face. We're not seeing their faces because we don't have our own true face, because what pride does, it prejudges our ability to judge anything, including ourselves. So we don't have our true faces. We're wearing masks. And until we are able, through humility, to remove the mask, we cannot see the true faces either of our neighbor or our God. That's basically what the novel's about. It's not even technically a novel, as the subtitle. It's a myth retold. We almost come full circle, because this is sort of almost has more in common with a Homer than it does with modern novels.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go out on Tolkien, because I know that's an author most of our listeners will be very familiar with. There's some controversy over Tolkien. Is he one of the great writers in the English language? Like Tom Shippey, I think, called him author of the century, of the 20th century, or is he just kind of, he just happened to kind of fall on these, this interesting story that's captivated people and spawned this whole kind of fantasy genre. I think you come down on the he's a great author side. So just tell us why he's important. Why should we read him?
Yeah, I might even play one-upmanship with Tom Shippey, because I would say that the Lord of the Rings is one of the great epics, that it's up there with the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and the Divine Comedy, these great epics of Christian civilization. It's better than Beowulf, which was Beowulf's a major influence upon Tolkien. Of course, Beowulf, to be fair, Beowulf's written as poetry, which is more difficult to write than prose. But nonetheless, for me, The Lord of the Rings is a prose epic, and it stands shoulder to shoulder, at least only very, very slightly lower than these great epics that I mentioned. So he's one of the great authors, and to have left The Lord of the Rings out would have been a serious sin of omission, for which I would require more than one confiteor and more than one mea culpa.
Yeah, and it's a terrific chapter. There are many more chapters that we haven't had a chance to get to. You end the book with Michael O'Brien's Father Elijah, published by Ignatius Press. I encourage everybody to check that out. But for now, we have to sign off. But the book is Classic Literature Made Simple, 50 Great Books in a Nutshell, now available from Ignatius Press. I want to encourage everyone not only to check out all of Joseph Pearce's titles available through Ignatius Press, but to check out his website at jpearce.co. That's co, not com, jpearce.co. Joseph Pearce, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.